The stagecoach wheels groaned in a harmonious, miserable protest against the hard-packed earth of the trail, a sound that had filled Eliza Hart's ears for 300 miles. It was the year 1875, and the Texas Panhandle stretched out before her like a bolt of rough, ochre canvas that no amount of ironing could smooth. Eliza shifted on the hard wooden bench, clutching her reticule as if it contained gold dust rather than a few withered peppermint drops and a letter of recommendation she had forged herself. Her hands, resting on her lap, told the story of her life better than her face did. They were not the rough, sun-spotted hands of a farm wife, nor the pampered, soft hands of a banker's daughter. They were pockmarked with 1,000 tiny white scars, the kiss of the needle. For 10 years, she had been the finest seamstress in St. Louis, capable of turning silk into a second skin. Now, she was nobody. She closed her eyes, trying to block out the dust that filtered through the leather window flaps. But the memory of the scandal was more choking than the grit. It had taken less than 1 week to dismantle a reputation built over a decade. A lieutenant, handsome in his blue wool uniform, had taken a liking to her work. And then, to her, she had been polite. Just polite. But when his advances were rebuffed, his vanity was bruised. The rumors started as a whisper in the choir pews and ended as a shout in the town square. She was branded a loose woman, a camp follower in the making. The dress shop owner had turned her out. The person had looked through her as if she were made of glass. So she had packed her trunk not with practical tools for the frontier, but with the remnants of her past life. Bolts of lace, scraps of velvet, a silver thimble, and a small, leather-bound book containing the recipes her mother had scribbled down before the fever took her. Kincaid Station. The driver bellowed from the box, his voice cracking like a whip. Eliza opened her eyes. The coach lurched to a halt, throwing her forward. She steadied herself and looked out. If St. Louis was a civilization, Kincaid Station was the very edge of the map. It sat on a rise of red dirt, a collection of timber buildings huddled together against the vast, terrifying openness of the sky. To the east lay the rutted road back to safety. To the west, the sun was beginning to dip, bleeding crimson onto the horizon. She stepped down, her boots sinking into the dust. The wind here was different. It did not smell of coal smoke and river water. It smelled of sage, dried horse sweat, and something sharp and metallic, like old blood. And underneath it all, the undeniable, acrid stench of burnt beans. A woman was waiting on the porch of the main building, wiping her hands on a stained apron. She was tall and broad-shouldered, with hair the color of iron filings pulled back into a severe knot. This was Martha Kincaid. "You the one who answered the post?" Martha asked. Her voice was as dry as the ground beneath their feet. "I am," Eliza said, straightening her spine. "Eliza Hart." Martha looked her up and down, her gaze lingering on the high collar of Eliza's dress and the pale skin that had clearly not seen enough sun. "You look like you would blow away in a stiff breeze. Miss Hart. The post said I need a cook and a general hand, not a lady looking to paint watercolors of the sunset." "I am not a lady," Eliza said, her voice steady despite the trembling in her knees. "Not anymore, and I can work. I have no one else to rely on. Mrs. Kincaid, which means I will work twice as hard as anyone who has a place to run back to." Martha snorted, a sound that might have been amusement. "Fair enough. The pay is $10 a month and a roof. The last cook ran off with a drummer selling patent medicines. He left me with a pot of scorched beans and 20 hungry soldiers due for supper." "I can fix the supper," Eliza lied. She had cooked for herself, and she had her mother's book. But feeding a garrison was a different matter. Yet, starvation was a powerful motivator. "Grab your trunk," Martha said, turning back to the dark interior of the station. "Let me show you the lay of the land." Kincaid Station was a precarious island. As Eliza followed Martha through the main dining hall, a long room with rough-hewn tables and a floor that smelled of sawdust and tobacco, she felt the tension in the timbers. This was a place where men slept with one eye open. "We are a treaty station," Martha explained, pushing open the back door that led to a covered breezeway. That means the cavalry stops here for fresh horses and mail, but it also means the local tribes are allowed to trade and camp on the designated ground, so long as the peace holds. They stepped out into the cooling evening air. To the left stood the corral and a bunkhouse for the station hands and passing soldiers. To the right was a smaller structure, a long, low building made of timber and adobe. "That is the kitchen and your quarters," Martha said, pointing to the near end of the building. "You have the room at the back of the pantry." Eliza nodded, gripping the handle of her trunk. It looked rough, but it was a shelter. "And," Martha continued, her tone dropping a fraction, "you have neighbors." She pointed a finger past the kitchen wall, less than 20 feet away. Separated only by a flimsy rail fence and the invisible line of a government treaty, stood a cluster of teepees made of buffalo hide. Painted with symbols Eliza did not understand. A fire was crackling in the center of their camp, sending sparks up into the twilight. Eliza froze. The stories from the St. Louis newspapers rushed back to her tales of scalping, of savage raids, of women carried off into the night never to be seen again. The church ladies had whispered that the Comanches were devils in human skin. "They are right there," Eliza whispered, the blood draining from her face. "That is the agreement," Martha said, her face hardening. "That group is led by Tohan. The army calls him Ghost Hawk. He signed a temporary parchment to keep his people fed through the winter. Part of your job, Miss Hart, is to cook the rations for the soldiers, but per the treaty. You also portion out the dry goods and the meat for Tohan's people. We share the well, we share the space." I do not know if I can do that," Eliza stammered. The proximity was suffocating. Martha turned on her, eyes flashing. "I buried my husband and my eldest boy on this ridge, killed in a raid 6 years ago. If I can stand here and do business to keep this roof over my head, you can stir a pot of beans. If you are too delicate, the stage leaves for the east in 2 days. But you do not look like a woman with a fare to return." Eliza tightened her grip on her trunk until her knuckles turned white. She had $3 in her pocket and nowhere to go. "I will stay." "Good," Martha said. "Start with the beans. Try not to burn them." As Martha retreated into the main house, Eliza stood alone in the breezeway. The wind picked up, rattling the dry leaves of the cottonwood trees. She felt a prickle on the back of her neck, the ancient instinct of being watched. She turned slowly toward the corral. A man was standing by the fence, watching her. He was tall, leaning effortlessly against the rough wood, but there was nothing relaxed about him. He wore buckskins that looked worn soft by years of riding, and his hair was long, black as a raven's wing, with a single feather tied into a braid. Across his chest and bare arms, Eliza could see the faint, jagged lines of old scars, a map of violence written on his skin. This was Tohan. He did not look like the drawings in the Penny Dreadfuls. He looked terrifyingly human. His face was sharp angles and copper skin, but his eyes were what held her pinned to the spot. Even from this distance, they were cold, dark, and utterly devoid of welcome. He looked at her not with lust or anger, but with a chilling assessment. He was weighing her. Was she another lie sent by the government? Was she a threat? Or was she simply another soft thing that would break under the weight of this land? Eliza wanted to look away, to run into the safety of the kitchen, but pride rooted her boots to the dust. She lifted her chin, meeting his gaze. Tohan held her eyes for 5 heartbeats, long enough to make her breath catch, and then, without a nod or a word, he turned his back on her and walked toward the teepees, his movement silent as smoke. Eliza let out a breath she didn't know she was holding. She dragged her trunk toward the kitchen door, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The kitchen was a disaster. It was a long, narrow room, dominated by a massive cast-iron stove that looked like a sleeping beast. The shelves were cluttered with sacks of flour that leaked white dust, and the air hung heavy with the smell of old grease. The pots hanging from the ceiling were dented and blackened with soot. Eliza set her trunk down in the small sleeping alcove at the back. It was barely big enough for a cot and a washstand, but it had a door with a heavy iron bolt. She slid the bolt home, testing it. It felt flimsy against the weight of the world outside. She lit a kerosene lamp, the yellow light pushing back the shadows. Her first task was the food. Martha had been right. The pot on the stove contained a blackened, solid mass of beans that had been boiled dry. "Waste," Eliza murmured, her voice sounding small in the room. "Sheer waste." She rolled up the sleeves of her gray traveling dress. Her arms were pale and slender, but her fingers were strong. She grabbed a chisel from the tool hook and began to scrape the ruin from the pot. It was hard, gritty work. She hauled water from the barrel, her shoulders aching, and set a fresh pot to boil. She found onions in a bin, soft spots rotting on their skins, and began to chop them with a knife she had sharpened on the stone hearth. Cooking was not so different from sewing, she told herself. It was about structure. It was about taking raw, shapeless things and stitching them together into something that could sustain a body. A dress sheltered the skin. A stew sheltered the soul. As the water began to simmer and the smell of onions replaced the stench of burning, the sun finally vanished. Night fell over the frontier with a sudden, absolute weight. And then, the sounds began. The kitchen wall that faced the Comanche camp was made of unpolished pine planks. Through the cracks, the night air seeped in, bringing with it the sounds of the neighbors. Eliza paused, her wooden spoon hovering over the pot. She heard the low murmur of voices. It was a language she had never heard guttural, flowing, rising and falling like the wind in the canyon. It sounded nothing like the harsh barking of the German shopkeepers in St. Louis or the clipped tones of the cavalry officers. Then, the rhythm of a drum. Not a war drum, not the thunderous pounding she had feared, but a soft, steady heartbeat. Thump, 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 thump. Someone began to play a mouth harp, a strange, vibrating twang that seemed to mourn the dying day. Eliza walked to the wall. She knew she should be terrified. She knew there was a warrior named Ghost Hawk on the other side who had looked at her as if she were dirt. But she pressed her hand against the rough wood. The wood was cold, but she imagined she could feel the heat of their fire radiating through the night. On her side of the wall, she had a cast-iron stove and a book of French recipes. On his side, there was open fire and buffalo meat, two worlds, separated by 1 inch of pine and 1,000 years of hatred. She thought of the lieutenant who had ruined her. He had been a man of civilization, a man who quoted poetry and wore white gloves. Yet he had destroyed her life with a smile. Tohan, the savage, had merely looked at her and walked away. Who was the dangerous one? Eliza went back to her trunk. She opened the lid and touched the soft velvet of a half-finished bodice she had been sewing before she was fired. It felt like a ghost. She picked up her needle case, the steel cold against her fingertips. "I am not a seamstress," she whispered to the bubbling pot of beans. "And I am not a whore." She threw a handful of salt into the water. "I am the cook." Outside, the wind howled around the corners of the station, shaking the window frames. The drumbeat from Tohan's camp continued, steady and unyielding. Eliza sat on a stool by the stove, watching the fire dance behind the grate. She was terrified. Yeah, she was alone in a land that wanted to kill her, sandwiched between men who saw her as a servant and men who saw her as an invader. But as the aroma of the stew began to fill the room, rich and savory, Eliza felt a small, hard knot of determination tighten in her chest. She had survived the gossip of St. Louis. She would survive the silence of the desert. She took out her notebook and dipped a pen in the inkwell. Under the heading October the 4th, 1875, she wrote just one line. "The horizon here is wide enough to bury everything." She closed the book. Tomorrow, she will have to feed 40 men. Tomorrow, she will have to face the warrior with cold eyes. But tonight, the fire was warm, the door was bolted, and for the first time in months, Eliza Hart did not cry herself to sleep. She simply listened to the drum, beating like a second heart in the darkness of the frontier. The dawn arrived at Kincaid Station not with a burst of golden light, but with a gray, suffocating heaviness that pressed against the windows of the kitchen. Inside, the air was already thick with the heat of the cast-iron stove. Eliza Hart had been awake since 4 in the morning, her hands moving with a desperate, rhythmic precision that she had once applied to French lace. She was not sewing silk today. She was wrestling with 50 pounds of flour and a side of cured bacon that was tougher than the boot leather of the men she was about to feed. Eliza wiped a strand of hair from her forehead with the back of her wrist, leaving a streak of white flour across her brow. The kitchen was a battlefield, and she was losing. The stove, a black monster of iron named the Beast by the previous cook, had a temper. It smoked if the wind blew from the north, and it roared like a furnace if she fed it too much mesquite. Yet, she had coaxed a fire from it. On the long wooden table, the breakfast was taking shape. It was not the elegant fare of St. Louis. There were no croissants, no porcelain cups, but there was food, real food. She had taken the hard, weevil-bitten flour and sifted it 3 times, cutting in the saved bacon grease until the mixture was like coarse sand, then adding water to make a dough for Johnny cakes. She dropped them into the sizzling skillet, watching them puff and turn golden brown. On the back burner, the beans she had soaked overnight and scrubbed the char off of were simmering with onions and a ham bone she had found in the larder. The coffee, black as a moonless night, boiled in a pot big enough to bathe a child in. At 6 in the morning, the bell rang. The doors to the mess hall swung open, and the sound of boots on timber filled the air. They came in waves. First, the soldiers from the small detachment stationed at the post, men in blue wool uniforms that were dusty and patched. Then came the drovers and station hands, men who smelled of horses and tobacco. Eliza stood behind the serving counter, a ladle in her hand, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She felt small. She felt exposed. In the dress shop, she had dealt with difficult matrons, but none of them wore Colt revolvers on their hips. A corporal, a man with a mustache that looked like a push broom, was the first in line. He held out a tin plate that looked like it had been used for target practice. "Beans again, I reckon," he grumbled, not looking up. "Same swill, different day." Eliza said nothing. She slapped a ladle of beans onto his plate, followed by 2 golden, steaming Johnny cakes and a thick slice of bacon. The corporal blinked. He looked at the food, then up at Eliza, then back at the food. He took a forkful of beans, chewed cautiously, and stopped. The room, which had been filled with the scrape of chairs and the murmur of tired men, went quiet as the corporal swallowed. "Hot damn," he whispered. "It is soft. The beans are actually soft." He looked at Eliza with a sudden, intense appreciation that made her cheeks burn. "You put an onion in this, miss, and is that molasses?" "A little," Eliza said, her voice tight. "To cut the bitterness." "Well, glory be," the corporal said, moving down the line. "The lady can cook." The tension in the room shifted. It did not disappear, but it changed texture. The men ate with a fervor that bordered on violence. For months, they had been eating charred sludge. Now, they had food that tasted like a memory of home. However, gratitude on the frontier often wore the mask of crudeness. "Hey there, little lady," a drover called out, leaning back in his chair and picking his teeth. "You cook like an angel." "Bet you taste sweet as one, too." A ripple of laughter went through the room. Eliza stiffened. She gripped the edge of the counter until her knuckles turned white. This was the danger. If she was too soft, they would eat her alive. If she was too hard, she would lose her job. "Eat your breakfast, sir," Eliza said, her voice trembling slightly but carrying across the room. "The stage leaves in an hour, and I doubt the horses will wait for you to finish your conversation." The men chuckled, but they went back to eating. She had survived the first wave. She turned back to the stove to flip the next batch of cakes, letting out a breath she had held for 10 minutes. It was then that the back door slammed open. It did not open with the respectful click of a latch. It was kicked or shoved, with enough force that it banged against the inner wall, shaking the pots hanging from the ceiling. A gust of cold, damp wind swirled into the warm kitchen, carrying the scent of wet sage and rain. Every soldier in the dining hall stopped chewing. Hands drifted instinctively toward holsters. Eliza spun around, her spatula raised like a weapon. Framed in the doorway stood Tohan. He looked bigger in the kitchen than he had in the yard. The low ceiling beams seemed to scrape the top of his head. He was drenched. Water dripped from the fringe of his buckskin shirt and plastered his black hair to his skull. But it was not just rainwater. Eliza's eyes darted to his right hand. It was wrapped in a rough piece of cloth, but fresh. Bright red blood was seeping through, dripping onto the clean floor she had scrubbed on her knees the night before. He did not look at the soldiers. He did not look at the weapon Eliza was holding. He walked straight to the center table, her prep table where a bowl of rising dough sat. In his left hand, he held a burlap sack, with a motion that was almost casual in its disdain. He threw the sack onto the table. It landed with a heavy thud, puffing a cloud of flour into the air. The room was deadly silent. The soldiers were watching, waiting for a reason. Tohan looked at Eliza. His eyes were hard, black flint. There was no gratitude for the treaty rations she had sent over an hour ago. There was only cold, simmering fury. "The food you send to our side is cold," he said. His voice was deep, scraping against the silence. "Cattle eat better." Eliza stared at him. The insult hit her like a physical slap. She had woken up before the sun. She had burned her thumb on the stove. She had scraped weevils out of the flour. She was a seamstress who had never cooked for more than 3 people in her life. And she was doing it for $10 a month in a shack at the end of the world. Fear evaporated. In its place, a white-hot spark of indignation flared up, the same indignation she had felt when the gossips of St. Louis had whispered behind their fans. She slammed the spatula down on the stovetop. The clang rang out like a gunshot. "Cold," she repeated, her voice rising. She stepped out from behind the counter, marching toward the towering warrior until she was only a few feet away. "You break into my kitchen, track mud and blood on my floor, and complain that the charity you receive is cold." Tohan blinked. It was a microscopic movement, but he was surprised. He had expected her to cower. He had expected her to scream for the soldiers. He did not expect a woman half his size to advance on him with flour on her forehead and fire in her eyes. "The wood you people chopped is wet," Eliza snapped, pointing a shaking finger at the wood box. "The stove is old. I have 2 hands and 40 mouths to feed before the sun is fully up. If you want hot food, Tohan, then you ensure I have dry wood. You ensure I have water drawn before I wake. And you do not throw things in my kitchen." She stopped, her chest heaving. The silence in the dining hall was absolute. She realized, with a sudden, cold wash of terror, what she had done. She had just shouted orders at a Comanche war chief. Tohan stared down at her. His face was unreadable, a mask of stone, but his eyes narrowed, shifting from the sack on the table to her flushed face. "You have a sharp tongue," he said softly. "For a servant." "I am not a servant," Eliza hissed, the wound of her past ripping open. "I am the cook," before Tohan could respond, or before the soldiers could decide to intervene and turn the kitchen into a slaughterhouse. Martha Kincaid appeared in the doorway between the kitchen and the dining hall. She held a double-barreled shotgun, the stock resting casually against her hip. "That is enough," Martha said. Her voice was not loud, but it carried the weight of iron. "Everyone, calm down." She walked into the kitchen, placing herself between Eliza and Tohan. She looked at the soldiers in the dining room. "Eat your breakfast. The show is over. If anyone draws a weapon, they answer me," the soldiers grumbled, settling back into their chairs, though their eyes remained fixed on the Indian. Martha turned to Tohan. "Ghost Hawk," she said, using his army name. "We had an agreement. You stay on your side of the fence." "The agreement says we eat," Tohan replied, not looking at Martha, his gaze still fixed on Eliza. "The agreement says we are treated as men, not dogs." "And you will be," Martha said. She turned to Eliza, her expression stern, but her eyes tired. "Eliza, under the treaty, we provide rations. If the food is cold, they have a right to complain. It is a small thing, but small things start wars out here. If they are hungry, they get angry. If they get angry, the peace breaks. And if the peace breaks, we all die. Eliza felt the trap snap shut around her. It was always the same. In St. Louis, she had been the scapegoat for a lieutenant's lust. Here, she was the buffer between two armies. If the beans were cold, it was her fault. If the peace treaty failed, it would be because she didn't stoke the fire hot enough. I cannot do everything alone, Eliza said, her voice dropping to a whisper, fighting back tears of frustration. I am one person, then we will fix it, Martha said pragmatically. She looked at Tohan. You want hot food. You send one of your boys to chop dry wood for the kitchen every evening. Do you want respect? You knock on the door. Tohan stood silent for a long moment. He looked at the sack of cornmeal he had thrown. Then he looked at Eliza. I do not send boys to do a man's work, he said. The English rolled off his tongue with a strange, precise elegance. It was not the broken, halting pidgin the soldiers mocked. It was fluid, educated. Eliza frowned, confusion cutting through her anger. You speak English. Perfectly. Tohan's lip curled slightly. It was not a smile. It was a challenge. Did you think I only spoke in grunts and hand signals? Miss Hart, or did your newspapers tell you we were too simple for grammar? He had heard her. He had heard the soldiers mocking him earlier. He had understood every word of the insults thrown around the dining hall. And he had understood Eliza's desperate defense of her kitchen. He had come in aggressive not because he was a savage, but because he was testing her. He wanted to see if the new woman was just another terrified bird, or if she had claws. Eliza looked at him with new eyes. He was not a monster. He was a man playing a very dangerous game of chess, and he was winning. Her eyes dropped to his hand again. The blood was dripping faster now, pooling on the floor. The anger drained out of her, replaced by the instinctive urge to mend that was ingrained in her very soul. A torn hem, a ripped sleeve, a cut hand, it was all the same. It was something broken that needed to be closed. Your hand, Eliza said. You are bleeding on my floor. Tohan pulled his hand back slightly. It is nothing. A slip of the knife. It is not nothing, Eliza said. She reached out. It was a reflex. She grabbed his forearm to stop him from hiding the wound. The moment her skin touched his, the air in the kitchen seemed to vanish. His arm was hard as ironwood. The muscle coiled tight beneath the damp buckskin, but his skin was hot, fever hot, under her thumb. She felt the ridge of an old scar, thick and ropey. Tohan went rigid. He did not pull away, but he froze, his breath catching in his chest. For a second, they were not enemies. They were just two bodies in a cold room. Eliza looked up, and Tohan looked down. She saw the flecks of gold in his obsidian eyes. She saw the exhaustion etched into the corners of his mouth. He saw the pulse fluttering wildly in the hollow of her throat. It was terrifying. It was intimate. It was completely forbidden. The heat from his arm seemed to travel up her fingers, settling in her chest. It was a shock of recognition, not of a friend, but of an equal. He was as hard and scarred as the land itself, and she, with her flour-dusted face and trembling hands, was the only one brave enough to touch him. Tohan jerked his arm away as if he had been burned. He took a step back, his face closing up again, the cold mask slamming back into place. I do not need your help, he said, his voice rougher than before. I need the food. Hot, at sunset. He turned on his heel and walked out the door, disappearing into the gray rain as quickly as he had come. The door swung shut, leaving Eliza standing in the middle of the kitchen, her hand still tingling where she had touched him. Martha let out a long sigh and lowered the shotgun. Well, the older woman said, leaning against the table, that went better than I expected. He did not scalp you. He speaks English, Eliza whispered, staring at the closed door. He does, Martha said. He learned it at a mission school before he ran away back to the plains. He knows our laws, Eliza, and he knows our lies. That is what makes him dangerous. He is not a savage you can trick with glass beads. Martha walked over and picked up the sack of cornmeal Tohan had thrown. "He is testing you. He wants to know if you're one of the ones who look at him and see a wolf, or if you see a man." "I saw a man," Eliza said quietly. "A rude, arrogant man." "Good," Martha said. "Keep seeing that, because if you start seeing a hero, or a villain, you will get yourself killed. Lieutenant Hale and his men, they look for any excuse. If they think you are sympathizing with the enemy, they will turn on you faster than a rattlesnake." Martha patted Eliza on the shoulder, a rough, awkward gesture, and went back into the dining hall to calm the soldiers. Eliza was alone again. She looked down at the blood spots on the floor. She should scrub them away. She should get the mop and erase the evidence of the intruder. But she stood there for a long moment, clutching her own hand. The memory of the scandal in St. Louis rose up like bile. The lieutenant there had used her as a shield to protect his reputation. He had discarded her when she became inconvenient. Here, she was being positioned as a shield again. A shield between the fort and the tribe, between Martha's business and the war. "No," Eliza whispered to the empty room. She walked over to the bucket of water and dipped a rag in it. She knelt on the floor and began to wipe away Tohan's blood. She would not be a pawn. She would not be a victim. Tohan thought he could intimidate her with his scars and his silence. The soldiers thought they could own her with their leering smiles and their demands. She scrubbed harder, the friction warming her cold fingers. She was Eliza Hart. She had stitched wedding dresses for the daughters of senators. She had walked away from the ruins of her life with her head high. If Tohan wanted a fight, he would get one, but it would be on her terms. She stood up, tossing the bloody rag into the wash bucket. She walked to the stove and shoved a piece of dry oak into the firebox. The flames roared to life, casting long, dancing shadows against the wall that separated her from the Comanche camp. "Hot food," she said aloud. "Fine, you will get hot food, but you will pay for it. Ghost talk, not with money, but with manners." She picked up her knife and went back to the onions. Her hands were steady now. The fear was gone, replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. She had found her place. It was not in the safety of the dining room, and it was not in the wildness of the camp. It was right here, in the heat of the kitchen, holding the knife. Through the wall, she heard the faint sound of the drum starting up again. This time, it did not sound like a threat. It sounded like a question. Eliza chopped the onion in half with a single, decisive stroke. "I am still here," she whispered. And for the first time since she had boarded the stagecoach in St. Louis, she actually believed it. The kitchen became a courtroom, and the ladle was the gavel. For 2 weeks, Eliza Hart stood between the cast-iron stove and the serving window, presiding over a trial that happened 3 times a day. The Treaty of Kincaid Station was written in ink on parchment in Washington City, but here, it was written in bean soup and salted pork. "You are giving the skins too much fat," a private grumbled one Tuesday, peering suspiciously at the bucket Eliza was preparing for Tohan's runner. "And us cavalry boys get the gristle. You get the same cut from the same hog." "Private," Eliza replied, not looking up as she sliced a loaf of dense bread. "If you want the fat, I can stop trimming your meat, but then you will complain about the grease on your tunic." The soldier huffed and moved on. 10 minutes later, a young Comanche boy, no older than 12, arrived at the back door. He pointed at the bucket, then at the sack of flour, shaking his head. "Not enough," he said in broken English. Eliza sighed, wiping her hands on her apron. She took the scoop, leveled it perfectly, and poured exactly 1 more cup of cornmeal into the sack. "Tell your chief that is the ration for the week. If he wants more, he can discuss it with the quartermaster. I only cook what is in the larder." The boy grabbed the sack and vanished. It was an exhausting dance. Eliza felt less like a cook and more like a diplomat armed with a butcher knife. She was scrutinized by 40 pairs of eyes. If the Comanche portion had more carrots, the soldiers whispered that she was an Indian lover. If the soldiers got the fresher bread, Tohan would stand by the fence, his arms crossed, staring at the kitchen with that terrifying, silent accusation. But Eliza Hart was a woman who knew how to bring order to chaos. She had spent her life turning shapeless bolts of fabric into structured beauty, and she applied the same logic to the kitchen. She found a stack of old burlap sacks in the shed. Instead of letting the dust blow in through the glassless window frames, she washed the burlap, hemmed it with sturdy thread she had brought from St. Louis, and hung curtains. She scrubbed the grease-stained walls until the pine wood shone pale and clean. She organized the spice tins by height, the spoons by size, and the knives by sharpness. From the corral fence, Tohan watched her. He did not speak to her, but she felt his eyes. One afternoon, while she was hanging the new burlap curtains, she saw him standing near his horse, brushing the animal's flank. He paused, watching her stretch to nail the fabric into place. It was not a look of lust. It was a look of puzzled recognition. In his world, the person who kept the fire and organized the teepee was the center of the family's survival. They turned chaos into order. He saw her taking this hovel of a kitchen, a place of grease and smoke, and stitching it into a home. "You sew the house," he had said once, passing by as she mended a tear in a grain sack. "I mend what is broken," Eliza had replied, not looking up. "The world is broken," Tohan said, and kept walking. The fragility of their arrangement was tested on a Thursday afternoon, when the sky turned the color of a fresh bruise. It started with the silence. The wind, which usually whistled through the canyon, suddenly died. The birds stopped singing. Even the cicadas ceased their rasping. The air grew heavy, static charged, making the hair on Eliza's arms stand up. She was in the yard, pumping water into a heavy oak bucket. The handles squeaked, creak, splash, creak, splash, the only sound in the eerie quiet. Then she saw the wall. It was not a wall of stone, but of earth. A towering, rolling monster of red dust and sand was consuming the horizon to the west, moving faster than a galloping horse. "Dust!" a sentry screamed from the tower. "Take cover!" Panic erupted. The soldiers scrambled for the barracks. The station hands ran to secure the shutters, but the real danger was in the corral. The smell of the approaching storm hit the animals before the wind did. 50 heads of cattle and 20 cavalry horses went mad simultaneously. They screamed, kicking at the rails. Wood splintered with the sound of gunshots. Eliza dropped the water bucket. She turned to run for the kitchen, but she was too slow. With a crash that shook the ground, the main gate of the corral gave way. A river of brown hide and terrified muscle poured into the yard. Eliza was caught in the open. She froze. It was the worst thing she could do, but instinct betrayed her. A steer with horns as wide as a man's reach was thundering straight toward her, blind with fear. She saw the foam on its mouth, the rolling whites of its eyes. "Move!" someone screamed. She could not move. The ground shook so hard her teeth rattled. She squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for the impact of 2,000 pounds of crushing weight. Then, something hard and fast slammed into her side. It was not the steer. It was an arm strong, unyielding, and smelling of leather. She was lifted off her feet. The world spun in a blur of dust and sky. She felt herself being hauled upwards. The air knocked out of her lungs. She landed hard across the front of a saddle, the pommel digging into her hip. "Hold on!" a voice commanded, a voice like grinding stones. Eliza grabbed a handful of horse mane. Tohan was behind her, one arm wrapped around her waist like a band of iron, the other controlling his paint horse with nothing but his knees and a single rein. He wheeled the horse around, putting the animal's shoulder into the flank of the charging steer, shoving the beast aside with a grunt of effort. The steer stumbled and veered away, missing them by inches. The dust wall hit them. Daylight vanished. The world became a swirling vortex of red grit. It filled Eliza's nose, her mouth, her eyes. She could not breathe. She buried her face in the horse's mane, coughing. Tohan spurred his horse, not away from the storm, but through the chaos of the yard toward the only structure with a wide enough door that was still open, the livery barn. They burst into the barn just as a second wave of cattle smashed against the outer wall. Tohan slid off the horse and immediately pulled the heavy double doors shut, dropping the locking bar into place. The silence inside was instant and shocking. The roar of the wind and the stampede was muffled by the thick timber walls, reduced to a dull, terrifying drone. Eliza slid down from the saddle, her legs giving way. She would have fallen into the straw if Tohan had not caught her. For a moment, they stood there in the semi-darkness, illuminated only by the thin beams of light cutting through the cracks in the roof. The air was thick with dust motes dancing in the shafts of light. Tohan's hands were on her shoulders, steadying her. He was breathing hard, his chest rising and falling against his buckskin shirt. Eliza looked up at him. His face was streaked with red dust, making his eyes look even whiter, even more piercing. "Are you hurt?" he asked. I do not think so," Eliza gasped, checking her limbs. "Thank you. You saved me." Tohan did not release her immediately. The barn was small, crowded with stalls and stacked hay. They were forced close together. The adrenaline of the near-death experience was fading, leaving behind a sharp, vibrating awareness. She could smell him rain, sage, horse sweat, and the metallic tang of adrenaline. It was not a civilized smell, but it was real. It was alive. He reached out, his hand hovering for a second before he used his thumb to wipe a smudge of mud from her cheek. The gesture was shockingly gentle for a man who had just muscled a 1,000-pound animal out of the way. "You stand in the open too much," Tohan said quietly. "On the plains, standing still is death." Eliza looked at his hand, then at his eyes. "I didn't know where to run." "Then you run to high ground," he said, "or you run to me." The words hung in the air, heavy and unintended. Tohan seemed to realize what he had said at the same moment Eliza did. He pulled his hand back, stepping away from her, the invisible wall between them snapping back into place. "Stay here until the wind dies," he said, his voice returning to its usual flat cadence. "I must check on my horse." He turned his back to her, attending to the cinches of his saddle. But Eliza saw his hands trembling slightly, not from fear, she realized, but from the same electric shock that was coursing through her own veins. The storm lasted 2 hours. When the doors finally opened, the world had changed. The sky was a brilliant, innocent blue, but the yard was buried under 3 inches of red drift. The station began to dig itself out, and with the clearing of the air came the arrival of 2 men who would bring a different kind of storm. The first was a wagon driver, a man named Silas Boone. He rolled into the yard on a buckboard wagon that rattled with the sound of bottles and crates. He was a large man, with a face that looked like uncooked dough and eyes that were too small for his head. He wore a suit that was too fancy for the trail, and a smile that did not reach his eyes. "Afternoon, folks," Boone called out, jumping down. "Looks like I missed the party." He spotted Eliza shaking out her apron on the porch. He tipped his hat, lingering on the sight of her. "Well now, Mrs. Kincaid didn't tell me she hired a beauty queen. Silas Boone, at your service, ma'am. Purveyor of fine spirits, dry goods, and necessities." Eliza nodded coolly. "Mr. Boone, I am the cook, not a queen, and the kitchen needs flour, not flattery." Boone laughed, a wet, unpleasant sound. He walked closer, lowering his voice. "A woman like you shouldn't be ruining her hands with lye soap. There's money to be made out here. Miss, a smart woman could partner with a smart man. I supply the entertainment for the soldiers. You could help manage the inventory. We could split the profits 60-40. Eliza felt a chill. "I am not interested in your inventory, Mr. Boone." "Everyone has a price, darling," Boone murmured, his eyes sliding over her figure. "Especially out here." Before Eliza could retort, a shadow fell over them. Lieutenant Marcus Hale stepped onto the porch. He was the commander of the small cavalry detachment, a man of 30 with a face carved from marble and ambition. His uniform was immaculate, despite the dust. He looked at Boone with disdain, and then at Eliza with something far worse amused contempt. "Boone, get your wagon out of the thoroughfare," Hale ordered. Then he turned to Eliza. "And Miss Hart, I saw you riding double with the savage during the storm." Eliza stiffened. "He saved my life. Lieutenant, the cattle broke loose." Hale took a step closer, tapping his riding crop against his boot. Careful, Miss Hart. Gratitude is one thing. Familiarity is another. We tolerate the Comanche because Washington tells us to. But do not forget who you are, or what you were. He paused, letting the silence stretch. He knew about St. Louis. He knew about the scandal. A woman with a complicated history should be extra careful about her associations. Hale smiled, thin and cold. We wouldn't want people to think you have a penchant for comforting the enemy, would we? He walked away, leaving Eliza standing in the sun, feeling colder than she had in the storm. That evening, seeking to escape the suffocating atmosphere of the station, Eliza walked to the edge of the property, near the treaty line. The dust had settled. The Comanche camp was alive with activity. She stood behind the safety of a cottonwood tree and watched. She had expected to see warriors sharpening knives. Instead, she saw a village. She saw women laughing as they scraped a hide, their hands moving with the same skilled precision Eliza used with a needle. She saw children playing a game with sticks and a hoop, shrieking with joy that sounded exactly like the children in the parks of St. Louis. She saw Tohan. He was not wearing his war shirt. He was kneeling in the dirt, holding a small boy on his knee, a nephew, perhaps. He was showing the child how to hold a small bow. His face, usually so guarded, was open. He smiled, a genuine, rare expression that transformed his harsh features into something handsome. Near the fire, a young woman was sorting bundles of dried sage and willow bark. This was Atsa, Tohan's sister. Eliza had seen her before, but always from a distance. Atsa was the healer. She moved with a quiet grace, examining a bruise on an elder's arm, applying a poultice. It was not a camp of monsters. It was a family trying to survive the winter. The lies of the newspapers, the sermons of the preachers who called them godless heathens, it all began to crack and peel away like old paint. Eliza stepped out from behind the tree. Tohan looked up. The smile vanished, but the hostility did not return. He stood up, handing the bow to the boy, and walked over to the fence line where Eliza stood. You watch us like we are animals in a cage, Tohan said, but his voice was weary, not angry. No, Eliza said. I watch you because I realized I do not know you. I see families. I see people. Tohan looked out at the horizon, where the sun was bleeding into the earth. My father was killed under a flag of truce, he said suddenly. 6 years ago, he walked into a fort to talk peace. A soldier shot him in the chest because he wanted a trophy. Eliza gasped softly. Tohan, I am so sorry. That is why I hate this place. Tohan continued, gripping the fence rail until his knuckles were white. I hate that I must eat your food to keep my people from starving. I hate that I must trust a piece of paper signed by a man I will never see. He turned his dark eyes on her. And I hate that I am beginning to respect you, Eliza Hart, because respecting a white person usually leads to death. It was the first time he had used her first name. I am not a soldier, Eliza said firmly. And I am not the government. I am just a woman trying to keep her stove lit. Perhaps, Tohan said. He gestured to the vast, darkening landscape around them. But men like Hale and men like Boone, they do not care about stoves. They care about lines on a map. He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper that carried on the wind. Listen to me, Eliza. This land doesn't belong to uniforms or papers. It belongs to whoever loves it enough to bleed for it. Hale wants to own it. Boone wants to sell it. My people, we are the land. And what am I? Eliza asked, her voice trembling. Tohan looked at her, his gaze lingering on her face, on the stray lock of hair blowing in the wind. You, he said softly, are the one standing in the middle. Be careful. Seamstress, the middle is where the arrows fly. He turned and walked back to his fire, leaving Eliza alone in the twilight. She looked down at her hands. They were calloused now, rougher than they had been a month ago. She had come here seeking work. She had found a war she didn't understand, and a man she was terrified to admire. But as she walked back to her kitchen, she knew one thing for certain: she was done hiding behind the curtain. If the arrows were going to fly, she would be ready. The poison that would eventually infect Kincaid Station did not arrive with a scream or a gunshot. It arrived in a whisper, poured from the lips of Silas Boone into the eager ears of bored, tired men. For 3 days following the dust storm, the atmosphere in the mess hall shifted. It was a subtle change, like milk turning sour in the heat. The soldiers, who had begun to look at Eliza Hart with a grudging respect after she improved their rations, now looked at her with something else entirely. Their gazes lingered too long on the curve of her waist as she reached for a pot. Their laughter stopped abruptly when she turned around, replaced by knowing smirks. It was Lieutenant Marcus Hale who had tilled the soil for this. But it was Boone who planted the seeds. The peddler spent his evenings by the corral, sharing a bottle of rot-gut whiskey with the enlisted men, his voice low and conspiratorial. He spoke of St. Louis. He spoke of fallen women who fled to the frontier to hide their sins. He twisted the truth until it was unrecognizable, painting Eliza not as a victim of slander, but as a woman of loose morals who had slept her way through the officer corps and was now looking for new bedfellows. Eliza felt the change on her skin like a rash. On a Tuesday evening, she was scrubbing the long wooden tables. Most of the men had left, but a group of 3 privates lingered near the door, nursing tin cups of coffee that had gone cold. One of them, a man with a jagged scar on his chin named Miller, watched her wring out a rag. "You scour that wood hard, Miss Hart," Miller said, his voice thick with unearned familiarity. "Like you are trying to wash something away." Eliza did not look up. "Cleanliness keeps the rats away. Private, though some seemed to find their way in regardless." The other 2 men chuckled, but Miller stood up. He walked over to where she was working, leaning his hip against the table edge. He smelled of stale tobacco and the cheap spirits Boone sold from the back of his wagon. "Word is," Miller said, lowering his voice to a rasp, "that you are not so particular about cleanliness when the sun goes down. Word is, you like the wild sort." Eliza stopped scrubbing. She straightened her back, gripping the wet rag until dirty water dripped onto the floor. "I do not know what you are speaking of, and I suggest you return to your barracks." Miller grinned, revealing yellowed teeth. "Oh, come now. We have seen you making eyes at the savage ghost hawk. Does he keep you warm? Miss Hart, I hear those Comanche tents get mighty cold, but the women or the women who act like them know how to generate heat." The insult was precise and filthy. It accused her of 2 things at once: treason against her race and a repetition of the very sin she had fled St. Louis to escape. Eliza felt the blood drain from her face, leaving her cold and trembling. It was the lieutenant all over again. It was the church ladies whispering behind their fans. No matter how hard she worked, no matter how many meals she cooked or how many shirts she mended, she was just a body to them, a vessel for their fantasies and their scorn. "Get out," she whispered. "What's that?" Miller leaned closer. "I said get out!" Eliza screamed, swinging the wet rag. It slapped against Miller's chest with a heavy, wet thud, splashing gray water onto his chin. Miller recoiled, his hand dropping to the knife at his belt purely on instinct. For a second, violence hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Then, Miller laughed. It was a cruel, barking sound. "Feisty," he said, wiping his face. "I like that. We will see how feisty you are when the savage moves on and you are left all alone out here." He turned and signaled to his friends. They sauntered out, their laughter echoing in the empty hall. Eliza stood alone in the dim light. She wanted to cry, but the tears would not come. Instead, a hard, cold stone settled in her stomach. She locked the doors, barring them with a heavy oak plank. Then she retreated to her sanctuary, the kitchen. But even the kitchen offered no comfort that night. The wind had turned northerly, dropping the temperature by 20 degrees in 2 hours. The fire in the great stove had died down to embers, and the wood box was empty. Eliza had forgotten to ask the stable boy to chop kindling in her distraction. She wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders and sat on the stool by the cooling stove. She picked up a soldier's tunic that needed mending, trying to thread the needle by the light of a dying oil lamp. Her hands were shaking so badly she could not find the eye. She was freezing. She was alone. And she was hated. Thump. A soft sound came from the back door, the door that led to the yard facing the Comanche camp. Eliza froze, the needle slipping from her fingers. "Who is it?" she called out, her voice trembling. If it was Miller coming back. The door opened. It was not Miller. Tohan stood in the frame, filling the doorway. He wore a heavy buffalo robe over his shoulders, the fur thick and dark. In his arms, he carried a large bundle of mesquite wood and dried sage. He looked at her shaking hands, her pale face, the single lamp guttering on the table. He did not say a word. He stepped inside, kicked the door shut with his heel against the wind, and walked to the stove. He knelt down, opening the iron door of the firebox. With practiced, efficient movements, he arranged the sage and the wood. He struck a match on the sole of his moccasin and touched it to the tinder. The sage caught instantly, a sweet, pungent scent filling the room, chasing away the smell of stale grease and despair. Eliza watched him, unable to move. He fed the fire until it roared, the heat radiating outward, touching her frozen cheeks. Only then did Tohan turn to her. He pulled a flask from his belt and set it on the table. Then he unclasped the heavy buffalo robe from his shoulders. "You are shaking," he said. "It is cold," Eliza whispered. "It is more than the wind," Tohan replied. He walked over to her. For a moment, she thought he would touch her, and she flinched, the memory of Miller's words stinging her mind. Tohan paused. His eyes narrowed, seeing the fear. He moved slowly, deliberately, and draped the heavy fur robe over her shoulders. It was heavy, warm, and smelled of smoke and earth. It felt like being embraced by the land itself. He pulled a crate over and sat down opposite her, near the stove. The space between them was small, intimate. The firelight danced on the walls, casting their shadows large and flickering, merging them into one dark shape. "Drink," Tohan said, nodding at the flask. "It is corn spirits, rough, but it warms the blood." Eliza took the flask. Her hands were still shaking. She took a sip. The liquid burned her throat, making her cough, but the warmth blossomed in her chest almost instantly. She handed it back to him. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was steadying. "Why are you here, Tohan, if the soldiers see you?" "The soldiers are drunk," Tohan said with a dismissive wave. "They celebrate nothing. They drink to forget they are afraid." He took a long pull from the flask, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. His eyes, usually so guarded, were softer tonight, glassy. He was not drunk, but the edge of his vigilance had been dulled. "I heard them," Eliza said suddenly. The words spilled out before she could stop them. "Private Miller, he said things about me, about us." Tohan looked at the fire. Men with small spirits always speak loudly. They fear what they cannot conquer, so they try to soil it with words. "I'm tired of it," Eliza said, clutching the edges of the buffalo robe. "I am tired of men deciding who I am just by looking at me. In St. Louis, I was a whore because I said no. Here, I am a traitor because I cook beans for you. I have no name. Tohan, I am just a target." Tohan turned his gaze to her. The firelight caught the sharp angles of his face, illuminating the scar that ran through his eyebrow. "In my tribe," he said quietly, "a woman is not a target. She is the center. She owns the lodge. She decides when we move camp. If a man mistreats her, the grandmothers beat him with sticks until he shames them to show his face. We fight the wars. Yes, but the women, they are the reason we fight." He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "I do not understand your people. Eliza, you build fences to keep things in, but you treat your own kind like strangers." "I do not belong with them," Eliza admitted. "And I do not belong with you. You belong where you stand," Tohan said. He reached out, his hand hovering near hers on the table. The distance between them seemed to vanish. The heat from the stove was intense, but the heat between them was different. It was magnetic, terrifying. Eliza looked at his mouth. She saw the pulse in his neck. He leaned in, just an inch. The air was thick with the scent of sage and the corn spirits. It would be so easy to lean forward, to close the gap, to let him erase the insults of the day with something real. Her heart hammered against her ribs. "Yes," a voice inside her whispered. "No," the fear screamed. "If you do this, you prove them right. You become exactly what they say you are." Eliza pulled back. She turned her face away, staring at the soot-stained wall. "I cannot," she whispered. "Please, I cannot be that woman." Tohan froze. He did not get angry. He did not grab her. He simply sat back, the moment breaking like a snapped twig. He took another drink from the flask, a long, slow swallow. "I told you I did not trust white people," he said, his voice changing tone. It was not bitter, but it was heavy with history. "Do you know why?" Eliza shook her head, pulling the robe tighter. "I was 16, Tohan said. He was staring into the flames as if he could see the past burning there. "We were camped near the Washita River. We had a white flag. My father had a paper, signed by a general, saying we were under protection." He paused, a muscle in his jaw jumping. "The soldiers came at dawn. They did not ask for the paper. They rode through the tents. I hid in the reeds by the river. I watched them shoot my mother while she was running with my baby brother. I watched them put a rope around my father's neck." Eliza covered her mouth with her hand, tears pricking her eyes. "They laughed," Tohan said, his voice devoid of emotion, which made it all the more horrific. "They laughed while they did it. Since that day, I know the truth. The paper means nothing. The flag means nothing. Only the strength of your arm matters." He looked at Eliza. "That is why I am hard, Seamstress, because if I soften, my people die." Eliza reached out and took the flask from him. She took another drink, needing the courage. "I was not 16, she said softly. "I was 24. I was the best seamstress in the city, a lieutenant. He was handsome. He brought me flowers. He told me he respected me. I believed him." She looked Tohan in the eye. "One evening, he came to the shop. He locked the door. He said since he had been so kind to me, I owed him. I fought him. I scratched his face. I got away." She gave a bitter, dry laugh. "The next day, he told everyone I had tried to seduce him. He told them I was hysterical, desperate. My employer fired me. The church elders asked me to leave. I lost everything because I defended my honor. The man who attacked me, he was promoted to captain last month." Tohan looked at her for a long time. The silence in the kitchen was heavy, but it was no longer empty. It was filled with the shared weight of their scars. "We are the same," Tohan said softly. "We are both bleeding from wounds given by men with smiles and papers." "Yes," Eliza said. "We are." For the rest of the night, they did not speak of war or rumors. They sat by the fire, two exiles finding warmth in the no-man's land between their worlds. When Tohan finally stood to leave, the flask was empty, and the fire had burned down to glowing coals. "Lock the door," he told her, "and sleep with your knife." The next morning, the fragile peace began to crack. Eliza was in the pantry, taking inventory. The supply wagon had arrived the day before, driven by Silas Boone. She needed to count the flour sacks to plan the week's baking. She hauled a sack of flour off the stack. It landed on the floor with a heavy, metallic clunk that did not sound like a meal. Eliza frowned. She knelt down, feeling the sack. There was something hard and angular inside, buried deep in the softness. She took her knife and carefully slit the stitching at the bottom of the sack. She pushed her hand into the white powder. Her fingers brushed against cold steel. She grasped it and pulled. It was a Colt revolver, brand new, oiled and loaded. Eliza stared at the gun, her heart racing. Why would Boone hide guns in the flour? The soldiers had their own armory. She pushed the gun back in and hurriedly stitched the sack closed with clumsy, shaking fingers. She moved to the water barrels that Boone had unloaded near the back wall, the ones marked potable water for the infirmary. She pried the lid off one. The smell hit her instantly. It was not water. It was whiskey. Cheap, high-proof whiskey. The pattern clicked into place, terrifying in its clarity. Boone was not just selling a few bottles on the side. He was smuggling weapons and enough liquor to turn the entire garrison into a drunken mob. But who were the guns for if the soldiers found guns in the Comanche rations? They would claim Tohan was planning an uprising. If the Comanches found them, they might use them. Or perhaps Boone was selling them to Tohan. No. Tohan had looked at Boone with disgust. Eliza wiped the flour from her hands, her mind racing. This was a setup. Someone wanted chaos. Hale wanted a war to advance his rank. Boone wanted chaos to sell his goods. Together, they were building a powder keg, and they were piling it right next to her kitchen. She had to tell someone. But who Martha was in town for supplies? The soldiers were Miller and his ilk. She had to tell Tohan. She waited until the afternoon lull. She saw Tohan by the watering trough near the corral. She walked over, carrying a basket of laundry to make it look casual. "Tohan," she said, keeping her voice low, pretending to struggle with the basket. He looked up, water dripping from his hands. "Eliza, you need to be careful," she whispered, looking around to ensure no one was watching. "The new supplies, they are wrong." Tohan frowned. "Wrong, how Weevils again?" "No," Eliza hissed. "Boone brought flour sacks that weigh too much. I think there are guns inside, and the water barrels are full of whiskey. They are mixing things up. If your people take those sacks, the soldiers will say you stole weapons." Tohan wiped his hands on his buckskins, his face darkening. "Boone is a snake, but he likes money. Why would he give me free guns?" "I do not think he is giving them to you," Eliza said with urgency rising in her throat. "I think he is planting them, or hiding them until something happens. Tohan, please, do not let your men drink anything Boone gives them, and check the sacks before you take them across the line." Tohan looked at her, searching her face for deception. He saw only fear and concern. "You take a great risk telling me this," he said. "I told you," Eliza said, gripping the basket. "I am tired of lies." Tohan nodded once, a sharp, imperceptible movement. "I will watch. Go back to your kitchen. Eliza, if trouble starts, you bolt the door." He turned and walked away, his gait stiff and alert, but the warning came too late, or perhaps the fuse had already been lit. Night fell heavy and moonless. The wind howled around the eaves of Kincaid Station, masking the sounds of movement in the yard. Eliza could not sleep. She sat on her cot, fully dressed, her mother's recipe book in her lap, her hand resting on the handle of her paring knife. She heard the laughter from the barracks, loud, raucous, the sound of men fueled by Boone's whiskey. Then, at 2 a.m, the silence of the outer yard was shattered. Crack! A single gunshot, dry and loud. It was followed immediately by the terrified scream of a horse, a sound that sounded disturbingly human in the dark, and the heavy thud of a body hitting the earth. "They killed the sentry!" A voice roared from the darkness. It sounded like Lieutenant Hale. "The savages killed the sentry!" Eliza leaped to her feet, the book sliding to the floor. "No," she whispered, her blood running cold. Outside, the world exploded into chaos. Shouts, running boots, and the ominous, rhythmic beating of the war drum from the Comanche camp, waking up to meet the threat. The rising action was over. The cliff had been reached, and Kincaid Station was going over the edge. The gunshot that severed the peace of Kincaid Station did not sound like a thunderclap. It sounded like a dry branch snapping under a heavy boot sharp. Final, and utterly irrevocable. Eliza Hart was awake before the echo died. She had been sitting on the edge of her cot, fully dressed, her hand resting on the handle of her knife. When the scream followed the shot, a raw, guttural cry of a man in mortal agony, she blew out the lantern. Darkness was the only shield she had left. She cracked the door to the kitchen just an inch. Through the window facing the yard, she saw chaos bloom. Lanterns were swinging wildly as men poured out of the barracks. The air was thick with the acrid smell of black powder. Near the main gate, a body lay crumpled in the dirt, face down, a soldier. "They killed him." Lieutenant Marcus Hale's voice tore through the night, high and frantic. He was standing over the body, pointing a saber toward the Comanche camp. The savages broke the treaty. They cut the sentry's throat. "I saw them," Silas Boone bellowed from the shadow of his wagon. "I saw 3 of them, painted for war." Slipping back through the fence, Ghost Hawk gave the order. It was a lie. It was a clumsy, desperate lie. But in the dark, with a dead boy on the ground and whiskey in their bellies, the soldiers did not ask for evidence. They roared. It was a sound Eliza had never heard before the collective, mindless baying of a mob demanding blood. "Burn them out," someone screamed. Eliza pressed her face against the cold glass. She looked toward the fence. The Comanche camp was awake, but there was no war dance. There was only the frantic movement of mothers grabbing children, of men kicking dirt over fires to hide their positions. Tohan was there, standing tall in the center, shouting orders in his own tongue not to attack, but to retreat. Then she saw it. Near the corner of the corral, 2 figures were scrambling back toward the barracks. They were stripped to the waist, their skins smeared with black grease and red clay to mimic war paint. But as one of them vaulted the fence, his moccasin slipped. He landed hard on his knee and shouted, "Damn it to hell!" It was English. Pure, gutter American English. Eliza's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. Hale had not just lied. He had staged a murder. He had killed one of his own men to start a war. "Fire!" Hale commanded. A volley of gunshots ripped through the night. The sound was deafening. Bullets chewed into the wood of the fence and tore through the buffalo hide of the teepees. Then came the torches. 3 soldiers ran forward and hurled burning brands over the fence. The dry canvas of the lodges caught instantly. Flames leapt toward the sky, painting the horror in vivid, flickering orange. "No," Eliza whispered. Through the wall of fire, she saw Tohan. He was not firing back. He was shoving a group of elders toward the ridge, using his own body as a shield against the soldiers' bullets. He was trying to save them. And then she saw Atsa. The healer was running toward a child who had fallen near the fence line. A shot rang out, not a volley, but a single, aimed crack from Hale's position. Atsa spun around, clutching her shoulder, and crumbled to the ground. The world seemed to stop for Eliza. Safety was behind her. In the bolted room of the kitchen, survival was staying quiet, letting the men kill each other, and sewing the shrouds in the morning. That was what the seamstress from St. Louis would have done. That was what a smart woman would do. But Eliza Hart was no longer just a seamstress. She was the woman who had looked Tohan in the eye and claimed the middle ground. "The middle is where the arrows fly," he had told her. Eliza grabbed the heavy oak box from the shelf, Martha's medical kit, and kicked the back door open. She did not run away from the fighting. She ran straight into it. "Eliza, get back!" Martha screamed from the porch of the main station. But Eliza did not stop. She vaulted the low rail fence, her skirts tangling in the wood, tearing the fabric. The heat hit her like a physical blow. The air was filled with smoke and the terrified screaming of horses. She skidded to her knees beside Atsa. The Comanche woman was pale, blood pouring from a hole in her shoulder, staining her buckskin dress black in the moonlight. "Press this," Eliza shouted, shoving a roll of bandage against the wound. Atsa groaned, her eyes rolling back, but she gripped Eliza's arm with surprising strength. "Go!" Atsa gasped. "They will kill you." "Let them try," Eliza said through gritted teeth. Well, a voice sneered from above her. Eliza looked up. Lieutenant Hale was standing over them, his revolver drawn and leveled at her chest. Behind him, Silas Boone was grinning, a torch in one hand. The fighting around them had slowed, the soldiers pausing as they saw a white woman kneeling in the dirt beside the enemy. The flames roared, casting long, dancing shadows that made Hale look like a demon. "I always knew you were a traitor, Miss Hart," Hale said, his voice trembling with the adrenaline of violence. "Giving aid to the enemy in the middle of a battle, that is treason. The penalty is death." "This is not a battle," Eliza said. She stood up slowly, her hands slick with Atsa's blood. She did not wipe them. She held them out, shaking, for every soldier to see. This is a massacre. They killed Private Miller, Boone shouted, trying to stoke the rage again. You killed Private Miller. Eliza screamed back. Her voice cracked, shrill and terrified, but it carried over the roar of the fire. She pointed a bloody finger at Hale. I saw your men. I saw them wipe the paint off their faces by the corral. I heard them curse in English. Hale's face twisted. She is hysterical. She is lying to save her savage lover. Shoot her! He cocked the hammer of his revolver. I saw the guns, Eliza yelled, looking frantically at the circle of soldiers. In the flour sacks, Boone brought Colts. Not corn checked the sacks. Hale and Boone are starting a war to sell weapons. Doubt flickered on the faces of the men. They lowered their rifles slightly. The accusation was too specific, too wild to be improvised. Shut your mouth, whore! Hale snarled, and his finger tightened on the trigger. But the shot never came. A shadow detached itself from the smoke. Tohan did not run. He struck like a viper. He slammed into Hale from the side, a blur of motion. The lieutenant's gun discharged into the dirt as he went down under the weight of the Comanche warrior. Boone dropped his torch and fumbled for the pistol at his belt. But Tohan was faster. He rolled, coming up with Hale's dropped revolver in his hand. He leveled it at Boone. Drop it, Tohan said. His voice was not a scream. It was ice. Boone froze, his hands in the air. Tohan stood over Hale, who was gasping for breath in the dust. The warrior looked ready to kill. His chest was heaving, his face streaked with soot and sweat. He pressed the barrel of the gun against Hale's forehead. Do it, Hale whispered, blood bubbling on his lip. Kill me. Prove you are a savage. My men will slaughter every one of you. Tohan hesitated. His finger hovered over the trigger. This was the man who had ordered the death of his people. This was the man who had shot his sister. Every instinct, every drop of warrior blood, screamed for vengeance. Eliza stepped forward. She did not touch Tohan. She simply spoke. Tohan, she said softly, look at the gun. Tohan's eyes flickered to the weapon in his hand. It was brand new. The oil was still fresh. And stamped on the metal of the barrel was a mark. Show them, Eliza said. Tohan lifted the gun, turning it so the firelight caught the stamp. He looked at the soldiers, the men who had eaten Eliza's food, the men who had lived in peace next to him for 3 months. This is not a government gun, Tohan shouted, his voice ringing out. It has the mark of the trading company, Boone's mark. He threw the gun at the feet of the corporal, the older man who had praised Eliza's beans on the first day. The corporal picked it up. He looked at the mark, then at Boone, then at the crate Boone had been guarding. The corporal walked over to the crate and kicked the lid open. Inside, nestled in straw, were a dozen more rifles. The silence that fell was heavier than the gunfire. You son of a bitch, the corporal whispered, looking at Boone. You killed Miller to sell rifles. It was Hale, Boone shrieked, backing away. It was his idea he wanted the promotion. Hale scrambled backward in the dirt, wiping blood from his mouth. He is lying. I am your commanding officer. I order you to kill them. The corporal looked at Hale, then at Tohan, and finally at Eliza, who was standing covered in blood, trembling but unbowed. Order denied, sir, the corporal said. He signaled to his men. Arrest them, both of them. The soldiers moved in. Grabbing Boone and hauling Hale to his feet, the mutiny was quiet, swift and absolute. But the night was not done with them. The kitchen, Martha's voice cut through the momentary victory. The wind had shifted. The fire from the burning teepees had jumped the gap. Sparks had landed on the dry shingles of the station kitchen. The roof was already smoking, and tongues of flame were licking at the eaves. The food, Eliza gasped. The larder was in there. The flour, the salted pork, the water, everything they needed to survive the winter was in that wooden box. Without thinking, she ran back toward the building. Eliza, wait, Tohan shouted. He chased after her. They burst into the kitchen together. The room was filled with thick, black smoke. The heat was unbearable. The burlap curtains Eliza had sewn were already dissolving into ash. The flour, Eliza choked, grabbing a heavy sack. "We have to get it out." Tohan did not argue. He grabbed 2 sacks, hoisting them onto his shoulder. They ran out, dumping the food in the dirt yard, then turned and ran back in. They worked in a rhythm born of desperation, side by side, the seamstress and the warrior. They weren't saving a building. They were saving the future. The roof groaned. "One more," Tohan shouted, grabbing a barrel of water. "Atsa's herbs," Eliza cried, reaching for the bundles hanging near the stove. "Leave them." Tohan grabbed her arm, pulling her toward the door. A beam crashed down behind them, sending a shower of sparks and burning wood onto the floor where they had stood seconds before. They tumbled out into the yard, coughing, their lungs burning. They collapsed on the ground, gasping for air. The kitchen was fully engulfed now, a roaring pyre against the night sky. The heat was intense, singing the hair on their arms. Eliza looked at Tohan. His face was black with soot, his eyebrows singed. He looked at her. Her dress was torn, stained with blood and dirt. They were alive. Slowly, the soldiers and the Comanche families gathered around them in a wide, silent circle. The fire crackled, the only sound in the stunned aftermath. Hale and Boone were being tied up by the corral. The dead sentry lay covered by a blanket. Atsa was being tended to by Martha. The treaty had been broken, burned, and shattered, but something else had been forged. A young private looked at Tohan, his rifle held loosely at his side. He looked scared. He looked like he didn't know who was in charge anymore. "What now?" the soldier asked, his voice shaking. "The treaty is gone. The major will send more troops when he hears about this." Tohan stood up. He wiped the blood from his mouth. He did not look like a savage. He did not look like a victim. He looked like a king standing in the ashes of his castle. He reached down and pulled Eliza to her feet. He held her hand firmly, openly in front of everyone. "The paper treaty is gone," Tohan said. His voice was raspy from the smoke, but it carried to the back of the crowd. "Let it burn." He looked at the soldiers, then at his own people. He gestured to the ground beneath their feet, the red earth stained with the blood of the sentry, with Atsa's blood, with the sweat of the soldiers and the tears of the women. "This land does not belong to uniforms or papers," Tohan said, repeating the words he had spoken to Eliza on the hill. But this time, they were a proclamation. "It belongs to whoever loves it enough to bleed for it." He looked at Eliza. She squeezed his hand, her fingers interlocking with his. "We have bled," Tohan said. "Tonight. We keep the land." The corporal nodded slowly. He lowered his rifle completely. "We need water," he said to his men. "Get the buckets. Help them put out the rest of the fire." As the soldiers and the Comanche warriors moved together to fight the flames, Eliza stood by Tohan. She watched the kitchen burn. Her mother's recipe book was in there. Her fancy lace was in there. The last remnants of St. Louis were turning to ash. She felt a strange lightness. The fear was gone. The shame was gone. She looked at Tohan, and for the first time, she did not see a stranger, or a neighbor, or a threat. She saw the other half of the circle. "My kitchen is gone," she whispered. Tohan looked at her, his eyes reflecting the dying flames. "We will build another," he said. "With stone this time." Eliza nodded. With stone. And as the sun began to crest over the eastern ridge, illuminating the wreckage of the night, Eliza Hart knew that the war was far from over, but the battle for her soul, the battle to decide who she was and where she belonged, was finally won. The smoke from the burning kitchen hung over Kincaid Station for 3 days. It was a thick, acrid reminder of the night the world almost ended. But unlike the smoke of a battle lost, this haze smelled of survival. 2 days after the fire, a column of cavalry rode into the yard. They were not the ragtag, demoralized troops commanded by Lieutenant Hale. These men sat straight in their saddles, their uniforms brushed, their sabers gleaming under the harsh midday sun. At their head rode Colonel Reynolds, a man with a face like tanned leather and a mustache that seemed to bristle with authority. He had come to investigate a report of a massacre. Instead, he found a mutiny that had saved a peace treaty. The trial, if it could be called that, took place on the porch of the main station building. It was not a courtroom of mahogany and velvet, but a tribunal of dust and pine. Colonel Reynolds sat in Martha Kincaid's rocking chair, a makeshift desk of crates before him. Silas Boone sat on a stool, his hands bound behind his back. The arrogance that had coated him like cheap varnish was gone, stripped away by 2 nights in the root cellar without whiskey. Beside him stood Marcus Hale. The former lieutenant was pale, his arm in a sling where he had been bruised during the tackle. He tried to stand at attention, but his eyes darted nervously to the ledger lying open on the crate. "This ledger," Colonel Reynolds said, tapping the book with a gloved finger. "It was found in your wagon, Mr. Boone. It details the sale of 20 repeating rifles to a private party for the purpose of, and I quote, inciting incident at Kincaid sector. It also lists a payout of $500 to a M.H. The colonel looked up, his gaze landing on Hale like a physical weight. "Lieutenant Hale, do you have an explanation for why your initials are listed next to the price of a small farm?" Hale swallowed hard, sweat beading on his forehead. "Sir, it is a fabrication. The woman, Miss Hart, she conspired with the savage. She planted the evidence." Reynolds did not look at Eliza. He looked at the corporal who stood guard. "Corporal, where were the rifles found?" "In the flour sacks, sir," the corporal answered sharply. "Stamped with Boone's trading mark, and the sentry, Private Miller. He was shot in the back with a service revolver that had been reported stolen from the armory 3 weeks ago. We found it in Boone's boot." The colonel closed the ledger. The sound was soft, but it echoed with the finality of a gavel. "Marcus Hale," Reynolds said, his voice quiet and deadly. "You are relieved of command. You will be transported to Fort Sill to face a court-martial for conspiracy, incitement of insurrection, and conduct unbecoming an officer. If the court is in a foul mood, you will likely hang." Hale sagged, the fight draining out of him. 2 soldiers stepped forward and stripped the epaulets from his shoulders. It was a violent, tearing sound, the sound of ambition being ripped away. As they dragged Hale and Boone toward the prisoner wagon, the colonel finally turned his eyes to the side of the porch. Eliza stood there. She was wearing a dress borrowed from Martha, which was 2 sizes too big and cinched at the waist with a piece of rope. Her hands were raw from clearing debris, and her face was still shadowed with fatigue, but she did not lower her eyes. Tohan stood a few feet away, near the hitching post. He was not bound. He was not bowing. He watched the proceedings with the impassive judgment of a hawk watching mice. Colonel Reynolds stood up. He adjusted his tunic and walked down the steps until he stood before Eliza. "Miss Hart," he said. "Colonel," Eliza replied, her voice steady. "I received a wire from St. Louis," Reynolds said. The station yard went quiet. The soldiers, who were pretending to clean their tack, froze. This was the moment. The scandal. The shame. Eliza braced herself. She expected the reprimand. She expected to be told that a woman of her reputation had no business involving herself in military affairs. "It seems," the colonel continued, "that the captain who accused you of impropriety has been dismissed from the service." Several other women came forward. He was a predator who used his rank to silence those he could not conquer. Eliza felt the breath leave her lungs in a rush. She stared at the colonel, unable to comprehend the words. "The church council in St. Louis has issued a formal apology," Reynolds said, his voice carrying clearly to the soldiers, to Tohan, to everyone. "It appears, Miss Hart, that you were not the sinner they painted you to be. You were the victim of a system that protects men at the expense of women." He touched the brim of his hat, a gesture of genuine respect. "You saved this garrison. Miss Hart, your country owes you a debt." Eliza stood frozen. For a year, she had carried the weight of that scandal like a stone around her neck. She had let it define her. She had let it drive her into the wilderness. And now, with a few sentences, the stone was gone. She did not cry. Crying was for the helpless. Instead, she felt a profound, shaking relief, as if she had been holding up a collapsing roof and someone had finally placed a beam beneath it. "Thank you, Colonel," she whispered. No, Reynolds said. Thank you. He turned to Tohan. The two men, warriors of different worlds, locked eyes. The treaty holds. Ghost Hawk. Reynolds said, a new shipment of rations, fresh rations, will arrive on Friday. Captain Lewis here. He gestured to a stern-looking man with kind eyes. Will be taking command. He is a man who reads before he shoots. Tohan nodded once. If he keeps his word, my arrows stay in the quiver. Fair enough, Reynolds said, as the colonel turned away to bark orders at his men. Eliza looked at Tohan. He was watching her. There was no triumph in his eyes, only a quiet acknowledgement. He had heard. He knew that the stain on her name had been washed clean. But as Eliza looked at the burnt remains of her kitchen, she realized something. The apology from St. Louis mattered. Yes, but it did not matter as much as the fact that when the fire was raging, Tohan had not asked about her reputation. He had simply handed her a bucket. The healing of Kincaid Station was slow, like the knitting of broken bones. The soldiers, shamed by their participation in Hale's near riot and grateful to be alive, worked with a newfound humility. They chopped wood without being asked. They tipped their hats to Eliza, not with leering smiles, but with awkward murmurs of "ma'am." But the real bridge was being built in the small, makeshift infirmary set up in the main dining hall. Atsa, Tohan's sister, lay on a cot near the window. The bullet had passed through the fleshy part of her shoulder, missing the bone but leaving a jagged, angry wound. Eliza sat beside her, a needle and thread in her hand. But she was not sewing clothes. She was showing Atsa how to stitch the torn buckskin of her dress so that it would not chafe the bandage. Smaller, Eliza said gently, guiding Atsa's good hand. If the stitch is too wide, it pulls. Atsa frowned, concentrating, her tongue poking from the corner of her mouth. She pushed the needle through. It was a neat, tight stitch. Good, Eliza smiled. Atsa looked up. She reached into the pouch at her belt and pulled out a handful of dried leaves, gray-green and fuzzy. She placed them in Eliza's palm. Sage, Atsa said in English, the word heavy on her tongue. For cleaning, spirit and body. She pointed to a jar of yellow salve on the table. And that, bear grease and willow, for the pain. Willow, Eliza repeated. You sew skin, Atsa said, gesturing to the bandage on her shoulder that Eliza had dressed. I sew spirit? Eliza looked at the leaves in her hand. In St. Louis, medicine was a man in a black coat with a bag of terrifying metal instruments. Here, it was a woman with a handful of leaves and a quiet song. We trade, Eliza said. I teach you to make the French knot. You teach me the willow. Atsa smiled. It was the first time she had smiled since the shooting. Good trade. In the corner of the room, Martha Kincaid watched them. She was polishing a glass, her movement slow. She saw the white woman and the Comanche woman, heads bent together over a scrap of leather. She saw the future, and for the first time in 10 years, she did not feel afraid of it. That evening, the air was heavy with the scent of rain that had not yet fallen. Tohan found Eliza by the well. Come, he said. It was not a request. Eliza followed him. They walked past the burnt skeleton of the kitchen, past the corral where the horses dozed, and out through the gate. They walked a mile into the scrubland, to a place where the earth opened up to reveal a small, hidden creek. It was a sanctuary. Tall cottonwoods lined the banks, their leaves whispering in the twilight. The water bubbled over smooth red stones, clear and cold. Tohan knelt by the water. He began to unwrap the leather bindings on his wrists. He washed his face, scrubbing away the last of the soot and the war paint he had worn for the colonel's benefit. Eliza stood on the bank, watching him. This was his place. He had brought her to the source of his strength. The colonel offered me a job, Tohan said, water dripping from his chin. He wants me to be a scout, to help the army map the canyons. Will you do it? Eliza asked, stepping closer. I do not know, Tohan said. He looked at his hands, large, scarred, powerful hands. If I help them map the land, they will own it faster. But if I do not, they will map it wrong, and men will die of thirst. He turned to look at her. What will you do? Eliza St. Louis has called you back. Your name is clean. You could go back to the velvet and the silk. Eliza looked at the water. She thought of St. Louis, the cobbled streets, the gas lamps, the polite conversations that hid sharp knives. My name is clean, she said softly. But my hands are not. She knelt beside him. She reached out and took his hand. It was rough, calloused, a map of a hard life. She dipped her own hand into the cold water and brought it to his arm, washing away a speck of dried blood near his elbow. Tohan went still. His breath hitched. I do not miss the silk, Eliza whispered. Silk is cold. It slips through your fingers. She looked up at him. The sun had set, and the light was turning purple and gray. His eyes were dark pools, bottomless and terrifyingly open. You are not cold, Tohan said. He reached out. His fingers, usually so sure with a bow or a rein, trembled slightly as he touched her face. He brushed a stray lock of hair from her forehead, his thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone. You are fire, he murmured. A fire that warms the lodge in the deep winter. Eliza leaned into his touch. The barrier between them, the wall of the kitchen, the fence of the treaty, the history of their races dissolved into the sound of the running water. He leaned in. The kiss was not like the storms that swept the plains. It was not violent. It was slow. It was the terrifying, beautiful slide of tectonic plates shifting the earth. His lips were warm, tasting of wind and water. Eliza closed her eyes. For a moment, she was not the cook, and he was not the warrior. They were just two people who had found each other in the dark. It was a kiss that tasted of survival. It was a promise that had not yet been spoken. When they pulled apart, they were both breathless. Tohan rested his forehead against hers. His eyes closed. If you go back to St. Louis, he whispered, I will burn the map. Eliza let out a shaky laugh, a sound that was half sob. You would get lost. I am already lost, Tohan said. You are the only landmark I recognize. They walked back to the station in silence, the space between them charged with the electricity of the decision that hung in the air. Eliza lay awake that night in the main house, where Martha had given her a room. The conflict raged in her chest. She could go back. She could open a shop in St. Louis. She could marry a clerk and live a safe, quiet life where the only danger was a pricked finger. But she looked at her hands in the moonlight. They were strong. They had held a gun. They had saved a life. They had built a home out of a shack. Could she really go back to sewing hemlines for women who fainted at the sight of a spider the next morning? Tohan met her on the porch. He did not have a ring. He did not get on one knee. He stood with his weight on one hip, his thumb hooked in his belt, looking at the horizon. I am leaving for the canyon tomorrow, he said, to think of the colonel's offer. He turned to her. Eliza, I do not ask you to follow me to the teepee. It is a hard life, and the winters are cruel, and I do not ask you to stay here if your heart is in the city. He stepped closer, his voice dropping to that low register that vibrated in her bones. But if you stay, we can make this place something else. Not a fort, not a camp, something new. He looked at her with a fierce intensity. Or, if you wish to go, I will ride with the stagecoach until you are across the river. I will ensure no man looks at you with disrespect. It was the ultimate respect. He was giving her the freedom to leave him. Eliza looked at the burnt ruin of the kitchen. She looked at the soldiers repairing the fence. She looked at the Comanche women trading beadwork for sugar near the gate. I am not a cook, Eliza said slowly. Tohan tilted his head. No, you are not. And I am not a seamstress. She continued. I am tired of working for other people. Tohan, I am tired of making things for other people to own. She pointed to the burnt shell of the building. I want to rebuild it, but not as a mess hall. I want a table, a big table, where a soldier can sit, and a drover can sit, and a Comanche can sit. And if they want to eat my food, they put their guns at the door and they pay coins or trade. She looked at him, her chin lifted. I want to own it. Heart and Ghost Hawk, partners. Tohan stared at her. Then, slowly, a grin spread across his face, the first true, unguarded smile she had ever seen. It transformed him, making him look younger, lighter. "Heart and ghost hawk," he repeated. "The soldiers will hate it. The soldiers will love the stew," Eliza countered. "And if they cause trouble," Tohan tapped the knife at his belt, "then the bouncer will remove them." "Partners." Eliza extended her hand. Tohan took it. He did not shake it. He held it, pressing his thumb against her pulse. "Partners," he said. Martha Kincaid was sitting in her chair on the porch, a blanket over her knees. She had watched the exchange. She had seen the handshake. She had seen the look in their eyes, the look of two people who had looked into the abyss and decided to build a bridge over it. She called them over. "You two are plotting," Martha said, her voice raspy but amused. "We are planning," Eliza corrected. "Mrs. Kincaid, I would like to propose a business arrangement. I want to rebuild the kitchen, expand it, make it a proper establishment." Martha waved a tired hand. "Eliza, look at me. My hands are stiff. My eyes are dim. I buried my husband here. I buried my son here. I have held on to this station out of spite and stubbornness." She looked at the station yard. "I am tired. Girl, I want to go east. I have a sister in Boston I haven't seen in 20 years. She writes me letters about the ocean." Martha reached into her pocket and pulled out a heavy iron key. It was the key to the strongbox, the key to the deed. She placed it in Eliza's hand. "If you and the warrior want this pile of dust and trouble," Martha said, "it is yours. Pay me a percentage of the profits if you make any. If you don't, just promise me you won't let the desert swallow it whole." Eliza stared at the key. It was cold and heavy. It was the weight of a future she had never dared to imagine. "Martha," Eliza whispered, "are you sure?" "Only those who have bled for the land know how to keep it," Martha said, echoing Tohan's words. She looked at the warrior. "You keep her safe, Ghost Hawk. She is tougher than she looks, but she forgets to eat when she is working." "I will feed her," Tohan promised solemnly. Martha closed her eyes, leaning back in her chair. "Good. Now go away. I want to dream about the ocean." Eliza and Tohan walked down the steps. They stood in the center of the yard, the point exactly halfway between the barracks and the camp. The wind kicked up, swirling the dust around their boots. It was the same dust that had choked Eliza when she arrived, but now it didn't feel like an enemy. It felt like the foundation. "We have much work to do," Eliza said, closing her fist around the key. "Yes," Tohan said. He looked at the horizon, where the sun was climbing high and bright. "But the wood is here. And the stone." He looked at her. "And the fire is lit," Eliza smiled. It was a smile that reached her eyes, clear and unburdened. "Let's get to work," she said. And together, the seamstress and the warrior turned toward the ruin, ready to stitch a new world out of the ashes. The seasons turned 5 times over the high plains of Texas, wearing down the sharp edges of the canyon and softening the scars on the land. The wind still blew with the same relentless force, carrying the red dust of the Llano Estacado, but it no longer carried the scent of fear. Kincaid Station had changed. It was no longer just a huddle of timber shacks clinging to the earth like frightened ticks. It had grown. The burnt skeleton of the old kitchen had been cleared away, and in its place stood a structure of river stone and heavy cedar beams. It was solid, permanent, and warm. Above the wide double doors, a sign swung on iron chains. It was not a hasty scrawl on a plank. It was a piece of craftsmanship, carved from polished oak. It read Heart and Ghost Hawk Table. Locals, however, simply called it the Table. On a Tuesday afternoon in late October, the year 1880, the main room was filled with a low, contented hum. It was a sound that would have been impossible a few years prior, the sound of 2 worlds eating lunch together. Eliza Hart stood behind the long serving counter. She was 30 years old now, and the sun had etched fine lines around her eyes, but they only served to accentuate the warmth of her gaze. She wore a dress of sturdy blue calico, practical for cooking, but the cuffs were embroidered with intricate beadwork in the Comanche style, a silent testament to who she was. "More stew, private?" she asked, her voice carrying easily over the din. The young soldier, a boy of 19 who had never seen a war, nodded eagerly, holding out his bowl. "Please, ma'am, and another piece of that cornbread, if you can spare it. It is the best I have had since Kentucky." "1 piece," Eliza smiled, ladling the thick, fragrant broth. "You have to leave room for supper." She moved with a fluid grace, transitioning from the ladle to the needle without missing a beat. At the end of the counter, a pile of fabric waited. A sergeant had torn his tunic on a mesquite thorn. A Comanche trader needed a canvas sack reinforced. Eliza handled both with the same care. The room was a tapestry of the frontier. To the left, a group of off-duty soldiers sat playing cards, their tunics unbuttoned. To the right, 3 Comanche cattlemen sat eating beefsteaks, speaking in low tones in their own language. In the center, at the long communal table, a traveling preacher was trying to explain the concept of Jonah and the whale to a skeptical old warrior named Stone Dog, who was more interested in the preacher's pocket watch. There were no walls dividing them anymore. The only rule at the table was simple, written on a slate by the door: no politics, no weapons, pay in coin or kindness. Eliza wiped her hands on her apron and walked out onto the floor. She did not walk with her head down. She moved like a captain walking the deck of her ship. She paused at a table where a drover was arguing about the price of a saddle blanket with a Comanche woman. "Gentlemen, ladies," Eliza said softly, resting her hand on the table. "If you are going to haggle, do it outside. You are curdling the milk." The drover looked up, ready to snap back, but then he saw who it was. He tipped his hat. "Apologies, Miss Eliza. We will take it to the porch." They respected her, not because she was a lady, but because she was the woman who had walked into fire. The door opened, letting in a gust of autumn air and a swirl of dry leaves. Tohan stepped inside. He had changed too, though the core of him remained as hard and unyielding as the canyon rock. He wore trousers and a flannel shirt now, boots instead of moccasins. But his hair was still long, tied back with a leather thong, and the knife at his belt was the same one he had carried during the raid. He carried a crate of apples on his shoulder, fruit brought from the orchards in the east. He set the crate down near the pantry with a grunt of effort. "Fresh from the wagon," Tohan announced, his voice deep and resonant. "Good," Eliza said, walking over to him. She reached up and brushed a speck of dust from his collar. It was a casual, intimate gesture that made the young private at the counter blush and look away. "The pies were waiting on you." Tohan looked at the room. He scanned the faces, white and bronze, soldier and civilian. He saw the weapons hung on the rack by the door, untouched. "It is quiet today," Tohan observed. "It is peaceful," Eliza corrected. "Peace is just a quiet moment between reloading," Tohan said, a shadow of his old vigilance crossing his face. But then he looked at the stew pot bubbling on the hearth, smelling of sage and onions. He took a deep breath, his shoulders relaxing. "But the smoke here, it smells better than the smoke of war." He was the bridge. He spent his days riding between the fort and the reservation, negotiating beef contracts, settling disputes over water rights, and ensuring that the young hotheads on both sides did not do anything foolish. He was no longer a war chief, but he commanded more respect now than he ever had with a lance. "Papa!" A blur of motion shot out from under one of the tables. A child, perhaps 4 years old, with hair as black as a raven's wing and eyes the color of polished hazel, launched herself at Tohan's legs. "Whoa there, little badger!" Tohan laughed, swinging the girl up into his arms. This was Lena. She was the heartbeat of the station. She wore a dress made of yellow cotton, but she wore moccasins on her feet. "Did you bring the red apples?" Lena asked, switching effortlessly between English and Comanche. "I brought the red ones," Tohan answered in her mother's tongue, then switched to English, but only for girls who finished their chores. "I swept the porch," Lena declared, "and I told the soldier not to spit on the floor." Eliza laughed, a sound that rang clear as a bell. "She did, too," The poor man was so terrified he nearly swallowed his tobacco. Tohan looked at his daughter, then at Eliza. The look in his eyes was fierce and possessive, but full of a profound, quiet joy. This child was the answer to every question the territory had asked. She did not have to choose a side. She was the river that flowed through both banks. As the afternoon wore on, the sun began to dip, casting long, golden beams through the windows. The crowd thinned out. The soldiers returned to the garrison for roll call, and the Comanche riders mounted their horses to head back to the reservation before dark. A stagecoach had arrived an hour earlier, dropping off a few weary travelers who would spend the night in the guest rooms Eliza had built at the back. One of them, a young woman with wide, nervous eyes, sat near the fire, sipping tea. She was dressed in stiff, Eastern clothes, clutching her reticule as if she expected a bandit to jump out of the soup pot. Eliza walked over to refill her cup. "You look tired, miss," Eliza said gently. "The road is long." "It is terrifying," the young woman whispered, glancing at Tohan, who was banking the fire for the evening. Are you not afraid, living so close to them?" She gestured vaguely toward Tohan. Eliza paused. She set the teapot down. She looked at Tohan, who had heard the question but did not turn around. He merely paused in his work, waiting. "Afraid," Eliza repeated. She pulled out a chair and sat down opposite the girl. "I heard stories," the girl said, her voice trembling. "In Philadelphia, they say this land is full of savages, that they burn and kill without mercy." Eliza folded her hands on the table. "I heard those stories too, when I came here 5 years ago. I came with a trunk full of lace and a head full of fear." She looked toward the window, where the first stars were appearing in the twilight. "I remember a night," Eliza began, her voice low and steady, "a night when the air was so thick with dust you could not breathe. I was trapped in the open with a herd of stampeding cattle. A savage, as you call them, rode into that storm. He did not ask if I was white. He did not ask if I was a Christian. He pulled me onto his horse and shielded me with his own body until the wind died." The girl stared at her, mesmerized. "And I remember another night," Eliza continued, "when a civilized man, an officer with a uniform, and a commission from the president tried to burn this station down to advance his career. He was the one who shot a woman. He was the one who lied." Eliza leaned forward. "This land is hard, miss, it has teeth, but it taught me a lesson that they do not teach in the parlors of Philadelphia." "What is that?" the girl whispered. "That the scariest thing in this world is not a painted face or dark skin." Eliza said, "The scariest thing is a human heart that has lost its shame, a heart that will burn a home to earn a medal." She looked over at Tohan. He turned his head and met her gaze. The connection between them was a physical force stronger than the stone walls, deeper than the well. "My husband," Eliza said, using the word with deliberate weight, "is a Comanche warrior, and he is the most honorable man I have ever known." The young woman looked at Tohan again. This time, she did not see a monster. She saw a man who was carefully arranging the logs so the fire would last the night. I see," the girl said quietly. "Thank you for the tea." "You are welcome," Eliza said, standing up. "Sleep well. The doors are locked, and the walls are thick." By 9 o'clock, the station was quiet. The travelers were in their rooms. Lena was asleep in the small cot in the back, clutching a doll made of corn husks. Eliza blew out the lamps in the main hall, leaving only the glow of the hearth. She sat in the rocking chair by the fire, picking up a small shirt Lena had outgrown. She was letting out the seams, adding a strip of soft deer hide to the sides to make it wider. It was a patchwork garment, cotton and leather, civilized and wild, stitched together with love. She heard the soft tread of boots behind her. Tohan did not speak. He simply stepped up behind the chair and wrapped his arms around her shoulders. He smelled of wood smoke, coffee, and the night air. Eliza leaned back, resting her head against his chest. She felt the steady, slow beat of his heart. The girl was afraid. Tohan murmured, his chin resting on the top of her head. She is young, Eliza said, her needle moving in the firelight. She thinks the world is made of straight lines, good and bad, us and them. She will learn, Tohan said. The wind bends all lines. He moved his hands down to rest over hers, stopping the needle. Eliza let the sewing drop to her lap. They stayed like that for a long time, listening to the wind howl outside. It was a lonely sound, a sound that used to make Eliza shiver with isolation. Now, it just sounded like the song of the land they shared. Do you ever miss it? Eliza asked suddenly. Old life. The freedom of the ride. Before you had to worry about apple crates and beef contracts, Tohan was silent for a moment. I miss the buffalo, he said quietly. I miss the silence of a camp before the sun rises. He tightened his arms around her slightly. But I was cold in that life. Eliza, even by the fire. I was cold. I was waiting to die. I was waiting for the bullet that would end it. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, breathing in the scent of her skin, lavender soap and flour. Here, he whispered. I am not waiting. I am living. You stitched me back together. Seamstress. Eliza turned in the chair, reaching up to touch the scar on his cheek. We stitched each other. Tohan, we are both just scraps that found a way to make a quilt. He smiled, that rare, soft smile that was only for her. He bent down and kissed her. It was not the desperate, adrenaline-fueled kiss of the night by the creek. It was a kiss of deep, abiding familiarity. It was the kiss of a husband greeting his wife at the end of a long day. It tasted of peace. Come, Tohan said, pulling her up from the chair. The fire is banked. The day is done. Eliza gathered her sewing. She looked around the room at the tables scrubbed clean, at the sign hanging above the door, at the rifle and the peace pipe crossing each other on the mantel. Yes, she said. The day is done. They walked together toward the back room, their shadows merging into one long shape on the floorboards. Outside, the great wheel of the galaxy turned over the Texas sky. The stars shone down on the Kincaid Station No, on the Heart and Ghost Hawk table. It sat on the edge of the frontier, a tiny speck of light in a vast ocean of darkness. But it was enough. The narrator's voice seemed to drift in on the wind, whispering the final truth of the West. The past is a heavy coat, weighed down by the lead of bullets and the gold of lies. It cannot be thrown away, for it is the only thing that keeps us warm against the freeze of history. But it can be altered. It can be taken apart, seam by seam, and sewn back together by hands that are not afraid to bleed. Freedom is not just the ability to ride into the sunset. Freedom is the courage to stop riding, to drive a stake into the hard red earth, and to build a roof over the head of the one you were taught to hate. The wind kicked up dust in the yard, swirling around the post where Tohan leaned in the mornings and the porch where Eliza sat in the evenings. It spun the red grit into the air, twisting it into shapes that looked like dancing spirits. But tonight, under the watchful eye of the moon, the dust looked soft. It looked like a ribbon of silk, endless and unbreakable, waiting for a seamstress to pick it up and stitch the next chapter. The screen fades to the purple bruise colors of a high desert twilight. Eliza stands on the porch, Tohan beside her, the child playing at their feet. They are small against the vastness of the world, but they are unshakable. The story ends, but the table remains open. Thank you for listening to this tale of the frontier. If Eliza and Tohan's journey touched your heart, or if you could smell the sage and the wood smoke as you listened, please let me know in the comments below. Where are you listening from tonight? Are you in a city like St. Louis? Or out under the open sky? I would love to hear your thoughts and share your stories. Please consider subscribing to Wild West Tales for more stories of grit, love, and survival. Hit the like button if you enjoyed this story, and press the hype button to help this video reach more listeners who need a little bit of hope from the history books. Your support keeps the fire in our hearth burning. Thank you, and happy trails.